you see, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole, I don't think. So I don't know what the answer is, honestly.
Well, I think it's one of the solutions I find is to talk about the consequences of the climate change, especially to disadvantaged groups and to wildlife and to nature, things that the left generally say they care about. I mean, you obviously have the climate extremists who doesn't matter what you say to them, they're always going to say the same thing. But I think other people, when they learn how electricity prices go through the roof, they learn how millions of birds and bats are being killed all over the world, they learn that the green energy sources are the exact opposite. They actually are filthy, probably the dirtiest energy sources on the planet. When you actually show that many of the causes that they hold dear are violated, I think it gives them a reason to take a step back and say, oh, yeah, the Ottawa River is still filthy and water resource funding is going down because it's all being sucked up by climate change. And I think that when you can put it in that, or things like water resources or water availability on reserves, as you've pointed out, they simply are not addressing these other issues. And it's largely because the money going into climate change is sucking it all up. I want to make one quick point. Only a week before the IPCC report was released to the public, IPCC scientists were actually admitting that their models run hot. They're significantly too warm. And so you would think that in a normal world, in a rational world, when they realize that the models on which the report is based are running way too hot, they would pull the report back and say, well, we've delayed the report because of this new finding. But instead, they go and release it to great fanfare. And of course, they release it at, from their point of view, the perfect time of year, because there's forest fires and wildfires everywhere. And that's normal. So they release it at a time when they can actually get that sympathetic hook.
Right. Well, but there aren't wildfires, forest fires everywhere. There are wildfires in British Columbia, but as my friend, just before you came into the studio, we were just concluding a discussion, and we got on to climate change again and forest fires. And I pointed out, it's funny because the amount of forestation in Ontario, where we live, is actually greater than British Columbia. And there are no wildfires here. And so the question, of course, is why not? If global warming, if climate change is the main cause behind increased forest fires, and I'm not convinced that we have an increase in the frequency of forest fires, but we certainly aren't seeing them in this end of the country. And this end of the country is a pretty big geographical area. So, when we talk about Ontario and Quebec, all right, and into New Brunswick and go south of the border and include New England, I mean, we're not just talking about a pretty big area in terms of country. We're talking about a pretty big area in the context of the globe itself.
Oh, yeah.
And we're not suffering from any of these things. So,
Well, I think you're right. A lot of it is simply media zooming in on specific areas and making a big noise about it. The thing is, increasing carbon dioxide actually reduces the incidence of fires.
Right.
And the reason is obvious. I mean, the stomata on leaves don't have to stay open as long to get the same amount of carbon dioxide, because, of course, they breathe in carbon dioxide. And so what that means is the plants lose less water to the atmosphere, so the soil stays moister. And so that actually reduces the incidence of wildfires. Similarly, as temperature rises, say temperature goes up a degree or two. We're not talking about going up hundreds of degrees, which would be, that would cause fires. But when we talk about a degree or two rise, that makes no difference to the incidence of fires, except that it increases the water cycle, and there's more evaporation and more precipitation, so the soil is moister. So both of those factors, increasing temperature to a point, I mean, we're not talking about a 100-degree rise, in the vicinity of a match. I was reading the other day, when we light a fire, it's an extreme temperature, 1,000 degrees, something like that. And that's why the fire starts. So anyone who thinks that a 1 degree, 2 degree, 5 degree rise is going to increase fire frequency, they're dreaming.
Well, as I like to say, at the risk of being sued, The reason we're not experiencing all of this is because Pacific Electric and Gas doesn't operate at this end of the continent.
Yeah, exactly. But, anyway, back to the climate change issue in China.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's really important to look at again, because it turns out that in the United States, they have a law that says if $250,000 donations are made to a university from a foreign government, they're required by the Department of Education to report it. But they haven't been doing it. So the Department of Education has actually clamped down on this. And they've insisted that Harvard and other schools actually report their foreign donations. And they were able to get over $6.5 billion in funds, mostly coming from China. And China is actually infiltrating our universities in ways that would kind of astound you. I just wanted to read to you a list here of from an article called "University Campuses Are the Major Front in the War." Okay, this is Chinese growing influence on campus. The FBI arrested Charles Leiber, the chairman of Harvard's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department, for accepting millions of dollars from the Wuhan Virology Lab and then lying about it. A UCLA professor was convicted of taking CCP, Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, money to illegally send semiconductors with military applications to China. A University of Kansas professor hid the fact that he was working full-time for a Chinese university while he was conducting federally funded research here. One of the top researchers at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas didn't reveal that he was being paid $14 million by a cancer institute in China. And, the list goes on and on. So here's just a summary. Between 2011 and 2017, the Chinese government, companies, and individuals gave almost $500 million to U.S. universities and colleges. According to the data, Harvard was the top recipient, reporting over $57 million from Chinese entities, not counting the head of that chemistry department who had been lying to the government. So the question is, has billions of dollars being input to our universities, American ones in this case, has it had any influence, do you think, on their teaching and research?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any question about that. Speaking even for myself, again, because I do a lot of work in public policy and in the political world itself, I, who have very strong opinions on a number of these things, and not just opinions, but things that I know are not true, even I myself will pause before I make a public statement thinking, what are the ramifications of me saying this, or one of my clients being advised to say this, on their political future or on my ability to get new clients, because we live in this very real cancel culture. And so now inevitably I'll probably just shrug my shoulders and say, well, I don't care. Okay. And go on with it. But if I, using my own personal example, if I'm going to think about it, then other people are going to be thinking about it too. And for me, we're not talking about millions of dollars or billions of dollars. We're talking about small contracts here and there. So I don't see how it's possible that the amount of money that is flowing into our post-secondary institutions from China, I don't see how it's possible that when questions arise that actually deal with Chinese policy or the Chinese government, that won't be a factor where they're not going to sit around the table and go, well, we're not going to go there. So self-censorship is a very positive thing. And it's an interesting topic because I've always felt that, back in the 80s, 70s and 80s and into the 90s, we talked a lot about economic diplomacy. And the idea that if only we increased our trade with some of these rogue regimes, that the result would be that they would learn to respect human rights. And, that just sounded, back in those days when I was hearing these discussions, that just sounded too neat and tidy to me.
Yeah, very convenient, because now we can sell them servers, you know.
And what's happened actually is exactly the opposite. A government like China, like the Chinese Communist Party, doesn't care so much for their workers' welfare or the opinion that their workers may have of them, the government, as much as we in our country care about our own, not just workers, but consumers care. And so in kind of a perverted way, the fact that we opened up China, or China opened itself up to all of this trade, and we just sort of rushed in the Western world, rushed through those doors, thinking that we were going to have some sort of a positive impact on human rights in a country like China, it was incredibly naive, and it's had, in fact, the opposite effect, where the real leverage now is that the Chinese government has it over us.
Yeah.
Because let's say tomorrow we say, well, we're going to have a trade embargo with the Chinese. Well, that's going to affect it's going to impact Chinese workers negatively, for sure.
Half of Walmart's stock would disappear.
Well, and so who's going to be penalized for that, punished for that? Well, governments here, because consumers want their consumer goods and they want them at reasonable prices. And so it would be even more naive to think that the government in China doesn't understand that dynamic. Okay? I mean, I'm not particularly, I don't have a 160 IQ or anything like that. I can figure this out.
Yeah. Well,
trust me, they figured this out too.
I used to work in the high-tech sector, and they were selling servers and other high-tech equipment to China, and I'd ask about it, and first of all, that was the wrong question to ask. But I think, quite frankly, their response was it would democratize them. And yet now, China apparently has 800 million security cameras. That's like it's more than one for every 2 Chinese. And they're almost all essentially focused on the East Coast, not in the far reaches of China. And so they essentially have a security camera for every Eastern Chinese, which is the majority of the population. And they have facial recognition software. They assign social scores to individual citizens based on what they do. So, I mean, this is a very much a form of 1984, the totalitarian supervision state, and we helped them do it. So I mean, it's completely crazy. I just wanted to read you a quick quote here from an article from Senator Rick Scott, who's a Republican from Florida. He was the former governor of Florida. He said, "The radical left has made its way into our universities and focused on combating perceived injustices, renaming buildings, liberalizing curriculum, and promoting safe spaces over open, honest dialogue, while staying silent on their connections to communist China, a country committing genocide against its Muslim population and actively suppressing the people of Hong Kong." And he goes on here talking about how the students, in many cases, are reporting back to China. And, it's interesting because after years of turning a blind eye to Chinese spying for the sake of grant money from the CPP and full tuition for Chinese students, universities must face the fact that the CPC's actions require a strong response from the United States, namely a decoupling between the U.S. and China in many areas of our natural life, of our national life. It's time for universities, many of which pride themselves on their intellectual independence and autonomy, to do the right thing and reject CPP's tyranny. So, yeah, it's tough because you try and buy things that are not made in China. And in the second part of our show, I think we should talk about this Muslim situation in East Turkestan, because that actually was an interesting presentation put on at the Peace, Order, and Good Government meeting. And I'll tell you about that because one of the activists there, a lady who was standing up for Muslim rights in China, she had some really good recommendations as to what we should do. So yeah, let's pick that up again next week. So this is Tom Harris signing out from Exploratory Journeys with my co-host, Joseph Benamy. Tune in next week for the continuation of our discussion of China's influence on the Western world.